The late afternoon sun burned against the cracked pavement as a small crowd gathered near the corner of a busy downtown street. A black woman stood beside her car, calm but tense, while a white police officer barked orders at her with an exaggerated sense of authority. His tone wasn't about law, it was about power. The woman's uniform shirt peeked faintly beneath her jacket, but the officer didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. When she tried to explain, he cut her off, accusing her of resisting, his voice rising loud enough for every phone camera in the area to catch. "You people never learn," he muttered under his breath, and with a disgusted sneer, he spat on the ground right in front of her shoes. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Hey, that's not right!" But no one stepped forward. The woman didn't move. Her eyes, sharp and steady, locked on his, not with anger, but with quiet control. She reached into her coat slowly, deliberately. The officer flinched, hand on his weapon, expecting trouble. But instead of what he imagined, she pulled out something small, metallic, and gleaming in the sunlight. A badge. Not just any badge. Hers. And the look on his face when he realized whose authority truly stood before him would change everything. If this moment already has you hooked, don't scroll away. Hit like and subscribe to stand against injustice and witness stories that reveal the truth behind power and prejudice. Before that humiliating scene unfolded, Captain Maya Robinson had always believed that the badge she wore would shield her from the kind of prejudice she grew up watching her father face. He had been a postal worker, quiet, kind, and deeply proud. Yet she'd seen how people looked at him differently when he walked into certain stores or spoke too assertively. It was those moments that pushed her toward law enforcement. She wanted to change the system from the inside, to make justice mean something for everyone. Years later, after a decade of training, service, and sacrifice, Maya had climbed the ranks. Not because anyone handed her a favor, but because she earned every ounce of respect. Her performance record was flawless. Her leadership, calm and precise. She was the kind of officer people turned to when chaos erupted. But off-duty, without the uniform or the title, she was just another black woman in America, unseen, underestimated, and sometimes deliberately disrespected. That afternoon, Maya was on her way home from an early briefing. She had changed into casual clothes, her jacket zipped halfway, badge tucked inside. She stopped at a local shop to grab some coffee before heading back to her car. When she stepped out, she noticed the patrol car parked behind her vehicle. Two officers stood nearby, one talking animatedly into his radio, the other, a tall man with a sharp jaw and a restless smirk, eyeing her with suspicion. "Excuse me, officer," she said calmly, approaching her car. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward her license plate. "This your vehicle?" he asked, his tone flat, accusatory. "Yes," she replied. He leaned closer. "You sure about that?" Maya recognized the tone, the one that wasn't seeking truth, but dominance. She kept her voice steady. "I'm sure." But before she could reach for her registration, the second officer muttered something under his breath. Maya caught it, a word that twisted her stomach. The kind of word she'd heard in the academy whispers, but never thought she'd hear again in public. The moment stretched. She could have pulled rank right then, flashed her badge, ended it all. But something in her stopped. She wanted to see just how far they'd go. Not out of pride, but out of purpose. Too many times she'd reviewed complaints from civilians who claimed they'd been profiled or disrespected. Too many times she'd seen reports adjusted before they reached her desk. So she waited. She observed. The officer circled her car, pretending to inspect, while the other leaned against his cruiser, smirking. "You people never have your paperwork straight," he said, loud enough for the nearby pedestrians to hear. Maya clenched her jaw but said nothing. She thought about every training session she'd ever led on professionalism, respect, and racial bias. The irony burned. Then came the moment that drew the crowd. The officer motioned for her to step aside, then spat near her feet, a deliberate act meant to humiliate. Laughter rippled from a few onlookers who mistook cruelty for entertainment, and Maya, still silent, made a choice. She slowly unzipped her jacket. The air shifted. A glint of her badge caught the light, but she didn't reveal it just yet, not until he crossed the final line. As her phone buzzed in her pocket, she glanced down, a message from dispatch. "Captain Robinson, your meeting report is due at HQ." Captain. She smiled faintly. They had no idea who they were dealing with. What would happen next wouldn't just expose one man's arrogance, it would tear open an entire culture of hidden bias within the force itself. The crowd's energy began to thicken, that uncomfortable buzz of tension that fills the air when injustice plays out in public. Some bystanders pulled out their phones, others whispered and exchanged uneasy glances. Maya could feel every gaze on her, yet she remained composed, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Years of training had taught her how to read situations, control her breathing, and never let emotion show before strategy. The officer, Sergeant Blake according to his badge, strutted like a man who owned the sidewalk. He spoke loudly, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "You're obstructing traffic, ma'am," he declared, though Maya's car was legally parked. "Mind telling me what you're really doing here?" His partner, Officer Daniels, stood a few feet away, smirking, clearly entertained. Blake seemed to thrive off the attention. "License and registration," he demanded, holding out his hand. Maya reached calmly into her purse and handed over her ID. He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he held it between two fingers like something contaminated. "You sure this is yours?" he asked. "Yes," she said quietly. He replied, tilting his head. "You don't look like someone who drives a car like this." That sentence landed like a slap. Maya didn't need him to explain what he meant. She had heard variations of it her whole life. When a black woman achieves something above society's expectations, people always find ways to question how she got there. "Step away from the vehicle," Blake ordered, circling around to inspect her car again. He glanced at the coffee cup on the hood, then flicked it aside, sending it spilling across the pavement. Gasps erupted from the crowd. One man called out, "That's not right," but quickly stepped back when Blake shot him a glare. Maya's patience was wearing thin, but she reminded herself every second of this mattered. If she exposed him now, she'd embarrass him. If she let him go further, she'd expose the entire pattern. She stood still, unflinching. Blake's voice grew sharper. "Why aren't you saying anything, huh? You think you can just stand there and ignore me?" He stepped closer, too close. His breath was heavy with arrogance and hostility. Then, with a cruel smirk, he spat near her shoes, a gesture so demeaning it made even Daniels shift uncomfortably. That was it. Maya took a slow breath. Her hand went to her jacket, pulling it open just enough for the silver badge to gleam beneath the sunlight. Blake's grin froze. She didn't have to say a word. His eyes darted down, reading the engraved letters. Captain Maya Robinson, Internal Affairs Division. Silence fell. The shift in power was instant, heavy, undeniable. The man who moments ago was performing dominance now looked like a boy caught stealing. Daniels's smirk vanished as he realized who had been standing before them all along. Maya let the silence linger. Then, with calculated calm, she reached for her phone and began recording. "This is Captain Robinson," she said into the camera, her tone professional but cold. "I am currently being harassed and publicly disrespected by two on-duty officers of this department." Blake stammered. "Wait, Captain, you're... "Continue," Maya said, unblinking. "Don't let my title stop your process. Finish what you started." The weight of her authority pressed down on him like gravity. He stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack, muttering something about a misunderstanding. But it was too late. Every bystander's camera was already rolling. The world had seen who he was before he realized who she was. Maya called dispatch, her voice steady. "This is Captain Robinson. I need a supervising officer and internal review present at my location immediately." Within minutes, 2 squad cars arrived, their lights flashing red and blue across the crowd. The onlookers stepped back, whispering. A lieutenant stepped out, confusion flashing across his face when he saw Maya standing there, calm, collected, badge gleaming, while Blake stood pale and rigid beside her. The lieutenant approached cautiously. "Captain Robinson, what happened here?" She looked directly at Blake, her voice cool and steady. Perhaps Sergeant Blake would like to explain why he felt the need to detain a citizen and spit on her without probable cause. The crowd gasped again. Blake tried to interject, but the lieutenant silenced him. Daniels looked ready to vanish into thin air. Maya handed over her phone. "The incident is recorded," she said, "as are the witnesses." The lieutenant nodded, already aware this wasn't just a routine embarrassment. This was a departmental disaster waiting to explode. But for Maya, it wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. Every department meeting she'd ever led on racial equity, every report she'd filed about bias, every ignored complaint. All of it had come to this moment. And as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, Maya realized something powerful. This wasn't her downfall or her shame. It was the breaking point of a culture that needed to be confronted. What came next would ripple far beyond that sidewalk. The press would catch the footage. The department's reputation would tremble, and for once, the truth wouldn't be buried under paperwork. The tension around the airport curb was thick enough to choke on. Blue and red lights painted the walls, and the crowd had doubled in size. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, why one officer now stood shaking under the weight of his own arrogance. Captain Maya Robinson stood tall, her badge still visible, her phone camera recording. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was the loudest thing in the scene. Lieutenant Harris, the senior officer on site, glanced between Maya and Sergeant Blake. "Captain Robinson," he said carefully, "I'll handle this from here." "No, Lieutenant," Maya replied firmly. "You'll document this. Every second of it. Because this isn't the first time Sergeant Blake has targeted someone who looks like me, and I doubt it'll be the last." Her words hit like thunder. The onlookers murmured louder, and phones lifted higher. Blake's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. "Captain," he stammered, "I didn't know who you were." Maya's eyes narrowed. "And that's the problem." Her voice sliced through the noise, sharp, deliberate, and filled with years of restrained fury. "You shouldn't treat anyone like that." Not a captain, not a civilian, not anyone. The lieutenant nodded silently, knowing she was right, but too cautious to intervene. Blake tried to salvage his pride. "Look, I was following procedure." "Procedure?" Maya repeated, stepping forward. "Show me where in your training it says spit on a woman or harass a driver for existing in her own skin." Blake's mouth opened, but no sound came. The cameras caught every second. Maya took out a small notebook from her coat, the same kind she carried during every investigation, and flipped it open. "Effective immediately," she said. "You're being placed on temporary suspension pending internal review." "Your badge, please." The crowd gasped. Daniels, still standing a few feet away, froze like he'd seen a ghost. Blake stared at her in disbelief. "You can't." "I can," Maya said coolly. "And I will." "Hand it over." Her words carried the weight of authority and justice, something the crowd could feel. Blake's hand trembled as he removed his badge. The metal that had once symbolized power now looked like a heavy reminder of everything he'd abused. He handed it over silently, his jaw clenched in humiliation. The moment his badge touched Maya's palm, a cheer erupted from the crowd. People clapped, shouted, and even recorded in disbelief. For once, the tables had turned. Justice had shown its face in real time. But Maya didn't bask in it. She simply said, "Thank you," and passed the badge to Lieutenant Harris. "Make sure it's processed correctly." Then she looked at the crowd and raised her voice. Not in anger, but in truth. "This," she said, "is why accountability matters. Not just for the public, for us too. No one wears this badge above the law phones captured every word. Within minutes, the video would flood the internet, a moment of raw, unfiltered justice." Blake tried to mutter something, but his partner Daniels stepped forward before he could. "Captain Robinson," Daniels said softly, guilt finally showing in his eyes, "I should have stopped him. I didn't. I'm sorry." Maya looked at him, not with hatred, but with that tired kind of disappointment only a leader feels when their team fails their own principles. "Then learn from this," she said. "Be better than what you just witnessed." The crowd started applauding again. It wasn't just for Maya. It was for every unseen person who'd faced what she just endured, but never had the power to speak up. As the officers escorted Blake away, Maya finally exhaled. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the weight of what had just happened. She knew the storm was coming. Press, headlines, department meetings, maybe even threats. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth had been seen. And once the world sees, it can't unsee. She turned toward her car, adjusted her jacket, and gave one last look at the crowd. "Drive safe, everyone," she said calmly. Then, with quiet dignity, she got in her car and pulled away, leaving behind a moment that would soon make national news. The video of the officer who spat on a black woman only to find out she was his captain would hit millions of views within hours. Hashtags would trend. News anchors would replay the scene on loop. But for Maya Robinson, it wasn't about fame. It was about the message. Respect isn't given by rank. It's earned by humanity. The following week, the city pulsed with quiet outrage. The video of the incident had spread everywhere. News channels, social media feeds, even international outlets. Headlines read, "Black female officer harassed by colleague. Turns out, she's his captain." Public reaction was explosive. Thousands flooded the department's social media with messages demanding justice. Civil rights groups cited the case as proof of the systemic bias rooted in everyday encounters, even among those sworn to protect. Inside the department, the atmosphere was heavy. Officers whispered in hallways, avoiding eye contact when Captain Maya Robinson walked past. Some looked at her with admiration, others with discomfort. But none could deny what she had done. She'd forced the mirror up to their faces. At the internal disciplinary hearing, Sergeant Blake sat across from her. He looked smaller somehow, the arrogance stripped away. His attorney spoke for him, but nothing could erase the footage the world had already seen. The video didn't just show misconduct. It showed the rot that festers when power meets prejudice. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stood up calmly, her voice steady. "I didn't want this to go viral," she began. "But maybe it needed to. I've worn this badge for 15 years, and in that time I've seen too many people like Sergeant Blake think it gives them permission to humiliate others. That's not policing. That's power addiction. And it's time we face it." Her statement wasn't just for the board. It was for every officer in that building. A week later, the decision was made public. Sergeant Blake was dismissed from service for gross misconduct and racial discrimination. Daniels, the silent bystander, was given mandatory retraining under Maya's supervision, a move that surprised many. When a reporter asked Maya why she didn't push for Daniels' punishment too, she replied simply, "Because silence can be broken. Hate can't." That quote spread faster than the video itself. Months passed, and Maya's name became a symbol of integrity within law enforcement circles. Universities invited her to speak. Advocacy groups quoted her in campaigns. But to her, the greatest victory wasn't fame. It was the quiet change she began to see. Officers started calling out their peers when they crossed lines. Citizens began to trust her precinct more. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, after another long shift, Maya stood in front of her mirror, removing her badge. For a moment, she thought of all the faces that had come before her. Those who had been silenced, those who had endured without justice. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer. For every one of us they doubted. The city lights flickered outside her window, and she smiled faintly. Justice didn't always come easy. Sometimes, it came one confrontation at a time. Final message. Sometimes, power reveals who a person truly is, but character reveals who they'll always be. Racism isn't just a problem on the streets. It's a problem in systems, in silence, and in the hearts of those who look away. If this story moved you, don't just scroll. Hit like, subscribe, and share this video to remind the world. Respect has no color, but injustice always does.